Hi everybody, welcome to the Vicon Online University. This is the Polygon 4 class, the second class on graph options. Today, our session objectives are adding graph panes to an open report, which we learned about last time, the view options associated with those graphs, how to adjust the axes ranges, the normalization schemes and creating new normalization schemes, and data tags and key statistics. You can add a graph pane for any processed outputs. Any of these processed outputs will show up under the expanded trial nodes. You'll see over on the right-hand side, walking 3 is expanded, and Colin, the subjects, is also expanded to reveal the model outputs. The kinematic data is what's highlighted there on the right, with the angles listed down at the bottom. An output can be graphed by double-clicking on any of the titles, such as right here with the left and right knee angles. Left or right components can be selected. If you only want to view one or the other, you can select the column title, and that will display either left nor right. It's important to note that if you just have left or right as the column header, that's the only component that will be graphed if you select those. So even though there might be right knee angle data in this trial, if it's set up how it is on the right-hand side, it's only going to graph the left for you. If you would like to return to both contexts, you can just click again, and it'll go right back for you. Another way to go about adding in those graphs is right-clicking on those processed outputs and using the right-click menu. You can graph either individual components or all components. You can also plot velocities and angular accelerations, angular velocities and angular accelerations for those joints under the filtered options there on the right. All components can be plotted independently on one graph or separately on individual graphs, and you will notice that separate is bolded. That's because it's the default setting. If you don't use this right-click menu and you just double-click, that's how it will plot them, is separately. Also, using that context option at the bottom of the pop-up menu, you can say left or right. So let's go ahead and go to Polygon and go through that part. So here we have a blank report. I've imported 5 data files, so I'm going to expand number 1. Colin is already expanded for us, and kinematic data. So I'll go ahead and click on angles. We talked about how you can graph them by just double-clicking. So here we've got knee rotation, knee ab and adduction, and flexion extension. If I close this, I can also look at just the left context or just the right context. And now they're each on a separate graph. Here are right side, rotation, ab and adduction, flexion extension, and then left side, rotation, ab and adduction, and flexion extension. To return, I just click again on the header and it brings both contexts back. I'm going to go ahead and close this and we'll open another one. You can also right-click and that brings up that menu I was talking about. You can either display the components individually, whichever one you like, all together on a single graph or separately. There's all of them on one graph. Or separate, like we're used to seeing. You can also see the angles, angular velocities, and angular accelerations if you'd like to plot those. And in the context, left and right, you can choose. Okay. We do have a lot of view options for these graphs. Under the Graph tab, you can toggle between a thumbnail view and a single graph view, What we've seen so far is a single graph view. It's set up with tabs. Because when those individual components are graphed, or multiple data sets or trials in a single pane, they are represented by separate tabs, much like Excel, except upside down. These components can be displayed by selecting a corresponding tab, as we've seen, and you can actually overlay tabs by dragging them one over the other, so the traces appear on a single graph. If you grab a hold of one, just left click and then drag it over another one, you will see a plus sign once that tab can be dropped. The other option is thumbnails, and thumbnails can be overlaid by selecting one, holding the left mouse button and dragging it to another graph. If you want to change the graph positions, you can use the right button to either swap them or exchange them into an empty space. You can delete a graph from the tab view by right-clicking on the tab and selecting the delete option right there in the middle. Or from the thumbnail view, you can delete it by left-clicking and dragging it outside of the graph pane, and your cursor will turn into a little trash can. There's also an option to remove specific traces or trials from the graph through the Remove button in the Graph tab. So once you've selected on a graph, it'll pop up this graph pane. You can click the Remove drop-down and then select specific trials or context that you'd like to remove. Or you can say all left traces or all right traces. And if you click on one, it'll actually give you the option to say delete selected trace, like you see grayed out there at the top. It is very important to note that if you overlay graphs manually, or if you graph all components on one graph, that the title doesn't automatically update to reflect what traces are displayed. You'll need to go in and do that manually through the Attributes pane. And you can go through the graph title properties to do that. You can also edit your graph axis options through this setting, these attributes. All you have to do is click on the selected appropriate axis, and then it'll pop up those x-axis or y-axis properties. So you can set the range and the units, and then edit the title for that also. So let's go ahead and go to Polygon, and we will look at that real quick. So here we are again. If I'm going to graph knee angles, right now I'm in the tab view, and if I double click, I can toggle from the thumbnail view to the tab view, or there's a button for it right here. I can overlay these graphs. You'll see that there's a little plus sign indicating that it's safe to drop it. But you do see now that that title did not update for me. So if I wanted to remove those traces, I can remove either the right or the left, or I can come in here So this one's rotation, so I should delete that one. And this one is also rotation, so I should delete that one. Okay, so now our graph is accurate again. If I wanted to remove one like this, now that I'm in thumbnail view, I can just grab a hold of it with my left mouse button. Here I could overlay it, but if I move outside of this, you see my cursor has a little trash can next to it. If I release, it just deletes it. So again, just dragging and dropping. And I can overlay these because they're both flexion extensions, so say I wanted to add those together. And if I wanted to reorganize them, I can right click and reorganize the orientation of those thumbnails. Okay, if I wanted to edit the titles, attributes is where I want to go. And the shortcut key is F9, but since you guys can't see that, we will go up here. This little blue bar is your data bar, your menus. So I can turn on my attributes bar. So you'll see now I've got all of these graph attributes, including graph title properties. So right now I'm selected on knee rotation, so it's got that. You can change that to anything that you like. You can change the font color and the size. Anything that makes sense to you. Also in the attributes, you can change the axis. I'm just going to zoom in on one of these so we can see it a little more clearly. If I select my y-axis, automatically it populates the y-axis attribute options. So I could go in and say, I want to adjust the axis properties. So I'd like it to always go to 65. And let's start at 0. And I do want it to be an angle measured in degrees rather than radians. So I'm going to OK, and then it's rescaled that graph option for me. You can do the same thing with your x-axis. Right now we're normalized as a percent, but if you wanted to change it to an angle, we could. Okay. So I'm going to adjust that back really quickly. There we go. All right. Any graph that you create is automatically by default normalized to a gait cycle. This does mean that the data appears from heel strike to heel strike. So instead of showing your left and right gait cycles timed like this, where they overlay, really in your graph they appear like this, where each gait cycle for both contexts is normalized. It is important to know that this is a schematic just for the time bar. Your time bar will not change like this. It will just have a scrolling vertical line. Those normalized graphs do change as the trial plays to display whatever the selected gait cycle is. And so as your trial plays, if you go from the first gait cycle to the second, your graph will actually update to reflect that second gait cycle that you're in. And while it's normalized, you will notice those red and green vertical lines that I was talking about will be on the graph to represent where that data point is in the trial. And then you can turn off that normalization to toggle back and forth from time to normalized. So here's an example of a normalized trial. Down at the bottom you can see on the x-axis that the green is stance and the blue is swing. It is normalized to 100% of the gait cycle. If we switch that to be a time, it looks like this, where suddenly we're in samples or frames, and it's no longer differentiating and lining up those gait cycles for us. You can add multiple graph panes all at once into a report. If you wanted to display multiple graphs on screen at once and thumbnails just won't work. So to do this, you have to lock the first graph pane, as shown by the arrow. And once that graph pane is locked, every time that you add in a new graph, it'll be an additional pane. So if you just double click the next output, it'll add a whole new pane in for you rather than just extra tabs in this view. If you want to move any of those panes around or reorganize your workspace, you can just click on the title bar where it says Graph View in yellow and drag it around the workspace. Once you begin dragging, you'll see that those little arrows will pop up to allow you to choose where you want this window to be. And that shading indicates how that window will snap to your workspace. As you can see by the blue shading, if the mouse was over this little blue arrow, then it's going to snap to fill this half of the screen. So let's go to Polygon and show you that. Okay, I'm going to close my attributes. Again, here is normalized. And if I unclick that, then it becomes time samples. And if I want additional graphs, I can click this to lock that pane. And then if I want to add in ankle angles, it has split my screen. And Polygon will split the screen to whichever direction makes more sense, whether that's vertical or horizontal, to fit the most data in there. So now I've got both of those in there, and if I would like to reorganize them, I can grab a hold of this one and begin to move. That arrow does pop up, so if I hovered here, it would fill half of the graph view, or the bottom half of the graph view, the left half of that graph view, or the right. Or I can go to the big ones, and then it'll fill the top half of my whole screen, or just the left half of the remaining space, the right half of remaining space, or the bottom. It is trying to accommodate the other graphs that I have in there, which is why it does seem kind of sporadic in its positioning. All right. There are default settings within Polygon that you have the power to change. Normalization schemes is one of them. Going through the Graph tab, you can click the Normalization scheme buttons, and you'll see this pop-up screen to allow you to create your own normalization schemes using any combination of events that are in your trial. So if your events are general events that represent, say, takeoff and landing for jumping studies, you can create a normalization to, say, flight, and set that up. The only key here is that you must have those events defined within the trial if it's going to create a normalization scheme off of it, and they do need to be consistent across whichever trials you're going to use with those associated reports. Another one that you can change is the variable ranges and the default axis options. If you know that always, every time that you have a gait report, your knee angles, the flexion extension angles are going to be between 0 and 75, you can set that so that every time you don't need to go in and scale those graphs individually. So just going to the variable ranges, this pop-up screen, you can edit those and then save them for the future. This is also where you have the option to change the units. Instead of going into the axis properties in the attributes pane, you can change a bunch of them at once, from degrees to radians or anything like that. If you have model analysis or processed output data, you can also edit that from the default parameters settings. If you click on default parameters, it'll give you any of those outputs, those model data. And then you can change those. If you need to call it something else, you can add a translation, or you can change the order in which they appear. You also have the options to adjust your system workspace and graph preferences through your options menu. If you go to the P, that should be File, and then go to Options, it'll bring up this Preferences pop-up box. And there you have System, Workspace, Text and Graph, and Average options. So this is where you would point Polygon to look for specific meshes or a root directory, specific exporters. If you make any changes to these preferences, they aren't automatically going to be applied to any report. You have to wait until you restart Polygon. So if you want to change your background colors, you can apply it and then save your report and then reopen Polygon to apply those changes. So just for reference, so we do have those default settings that you can change. There's the normalization schemes. Right now we have it set up to a gate cycle, but you could add a new one. So then you can have a whole new normalization scheme to turn on if you have those specific trial types loaded. You also have the variable ranges pop up. So this is where you can edit any of those. For example, knee angles. You can edit, change the names, the default graph titles. This is where it'll give you the positive, negative descriptions. You can edit your ranges and your units. If this is something that's an anthropometric measure, you can also quantify that as a subject measurement so that it's not going to be a variable. And your default parameters. Any of these, say you wanted to change the wording of it from stride length to I'm having a hard time thinking of some synonym for stride, so it's a two-step length, if that makes more sense for you. Or if these are actually related to your jumping trial, then you can change them and give them a translation so that they'll go with jumping characteristics rather than gait characteristics. The other option is in the Polygon file options. And again, this is where you're going to point Polygon to look for specific files like your root directory and your meshes. You can adjust your workspace options. We're going to talk more about this next week, but colors, floor sizes, tiles, all of the, I guess, the really pretty stuff inside of Polygon you can adjust through here. You can also adjust your text and your graphs. Talk about the labeling size if you want to increase that, font size, any of your colors that you'd like to change. All of that can be accessed here if you don't want to go through one by one and change the attributes. We'll talk more about the averages in a couple of weeks. Another option that you have for graphs is you can add traces onto them. By selecting a trace, it's going to, if you select the trace and then bring up your attributes pane, you can edit any of those. If you don't like the color or the thickness, if you're trying to highlight a specific trace in comparison to the others, you can make modifications to the line style to make it stand out a little bit better. You can also add average data traces to your graphs. Your average data can also be edited through those attributes panes, including the standard deviation shading color, or any of the, if you want to show the mean line in the middle that's displayed, the context left or right, the colors, all of that can be edited through the attributes pane. And what these averages are standard deviations of the average gate cycles that are loaded on that graph. And so if you have multiple gate cycles loaded onto a graph, it's going to be averaging those. The average line, you have the option to show that mean line. You can also show the standard deviations, the one on either side of that shading, and adjust those shading colors if it's giving you issues. So to turn on, here's traces. And here are the attributes for those traces. You will see that you can adjust the color. If you change a color, you can change the color, and then you also must say change context appearance from true to false. True is indicating that it will always follow the right is green, left is red rule. If you indicate false, it will change to whatever you have selected. The thickness can change to a thicker line, or you have options to go line types. And let's go back to a 1. There we go. Now we're not so thick. So you have those options to adjust them, especially if you're comparing again to other gate cycles. To turn on the average traces, you can just click this average trace button. Again, it's going to show those standard deviations, and then if you click on them, now you've got options. So let's go back to this one. You can show the mean line in the middle. And now if you click away, it's still going to be there, whereas the other one you have to hover over. You can also show the lines on either side, just to give it a little bit more clarity. And again, you can adjust the thickness of those lines. If you wanted to change the color, you have that option as well. It does have a default opacity setting. That way, if you have graphs that are overlaid, you can still see the one underneath. Alright, so you also have options for your graphs. You can add data tags to them, whether they're numeric, key data, or text labels. You can add any of those to traces or the average traces. So aside from the tags, we also have frame tags that will give you the values of a specific frame that you can snap to a point. And value range tags, and that's going to show you the vertical distance between any two given points wherever you place them. Sometimes this is helpful for indicating minimum and maximum ranges for knee joints or any sort of joints, and the frame can highlight a specific point in a trial. Other types of data tags that we've got are time ranges, where you can show the time it took to get from one point to another on the graph. A slope, which is just going to be a general slope value at any point that you select along the graph. And it is important to note that whenever you drag these data tags, they aren't going to snap to the local minimum and maximum values. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to put a brand new graph up here. Double clicking. And then go through the different types of data tags. So they're all located right here. We have the frame data tag, which is going to snap to whichever frame you're on. and then give you the information for that. So that one is 11.4% into the gate cycle, and the angle is at 27.2 degrees. You also can do values, and it is vertical values. So you can say, let's snap to the minima, and then for our second one, let's go to the maxima. So that vertical difference is 46.6 degrees. You have time range options. Oh, I'm running onto the next gate cycle. Let's do this way. There we go. That's a more appropriate one. So you do have those time ranges from when things occurred, or just a general slope. So those are going to be the data tags. You can also add labels, which we had talked about, numeric labels. There it is. Okay. So you've got numeric labels. You can add a text label to help indicate anything that you need to see. You can say right or left. You can give it a title. You can give it a specific name. You can talk about pre and post. Or you can also do keys. So that's going to be the trial, whichever context it is, what the actual angle is, and its direction. So those are your options for both the labels and the data tags. Now I'm going to clear some of those out for us. Okay, and you can just clear those either using that right menu, like I said, with delete, or just clicking on them once they're highlighted, pressing the delete button on your keyboard. There is a new feature in Polygon 4 called the key stats or key statistics. These are going to be automatically generated based on your range data from the graphs that you have visualized. They are set to a default stance and swing range for walking trials and gait. And what they show is range, mean, standard deviation, minimum value, maximum value, and the time when the minimum and maximum occurred. So we've got a graph, key stats. Key stats pops up underneath any of your graphs, and as you can see there on the bottom, it's got the ranges for the entire graph, stance and swing, and then it's got range, mean, standard deviation, minima, maxima, time that minima occurred, and time of the maxima occurred. You can edit the ranges for those key stats to be event-based or time-based by creating or editing the range, the actual time range. So what that looks like in Polygon, we've got this graph option. Here's the key stats button to show those. Here you can see the all graphs, the stance, and the swing. It's got the range, the mean, the standard deviation, the minima and maxima angles, the time of the occurrence for those. So at 3.38 seconds into the trial is when the maximum knee flexion occurred. So you can go through those. Those are sometimes very, very helpful. Or to create those ranges, you can have an event range that's going to be a normalization scheme, or an absolute range based on time. So you can give it a new range. It can be any time. If it's an absolute, you're probably going to want seconds for these purposes. And then you can figure out what it's called. You can write something in there if you like, and then make that your active time range. So review of what we've done today. We've opened graph views inside of our reports. We've discussed the view options for those graphs and modifying those graph views, adding additional panes and reorganizing the panes. We've set up normalization schemes based on other events. And then we've discussed the data tags, the different types, and the key statistics options.